Good morning, and welcome back to the Morning Endurance Call. I'm Keith Erwood, and this is a free daily, 15-minute or less, leadership ritual for business owners, executives, and preparedness professionals who want to think more clearly under pressure and lead with more clarity in uncertain times. Each weekday morning, we spend a few minutes talking about what it really takes to build stronger businesses, stronger decision-making, and stronger leadership in a world where disruption is no longer rare. Today's topic is this: a crisis plan does not create crisis leadership. This matters because one of the most common mistakes organizations make is assuming that because a crisis plan exists, crisis leadership exists too. They're not the same thing. A crisis plan can be useful. A crisis plan can provide structure, clarify roles, escalation paths, communication expectations, and response procedures. But a crisis plan by itself does not create leadership capability required to perform well when pressure from a crisis mounts. That is a key distinction, because in a real crisis, the organization does not just need a document. It needs leaders who can think clearly, prioritize effectively, and communicate with discipline, make decisions under uncertainty, and help the business move forward when conditions are unstable. That is leadership, and leadership is not created by a document alone. This is one of the reasons I'll often say a crisis plan can support leadership, but it cannot be a substitute for it. That distinction matters a great deal, because many organizations feel reassured by the existence of a plan. They know the document was written, they know it was reviewed, they know the structure exists, and they know that roles have been described. All of that can be helpful, but when a real incident happens, something else gets tested. The organization discovers whether leaders can actually use that structure under pressure. Can they interpret the situation clearly, and can they avoid overreacting or even underreacting? Can they make decisions when information is incomplete? Can they align the right people quickly? And can they communicate without creating confusion? Also, can they maintain focus when the environment becomes noisy, emotional, and fast-moving? Those are leadership questions, and that is why a crisis plan itself does not create crisis leadership. Let's make this practical. Why do people often confuse the two? One reason is that plans are visible. They're tangible, they can be reviewed, they can be approved, and they're stored, updated, and referenced. Leadership capability is different. It is less visible until it is tested. You often do not fully know the quality of crisis leadership until the organization is under pressure. That is when decision-making habits show up. That is when communication discipline shows up. That's when role clarity either holds or breaks down. It's when executive alignment either strengthens or weakens the response. So, the document may exist long before anyone knows whether leadership capability is truly strong enough. Another reason people confuse plans with leadership is because plans create a false sense of completeness. If a document exists, it can feel like the problem has been solved. But preparedness does not work that way. A plan might answer who should be involved, what the response structure is, how escalations should occur, and what communication categories exist. What the early response steps might look like. But a plan cannot fully answer how leaders will behave under pressure, and whether they will stay aligned, whether decisions will come fast enough, whether communications will be clear enough, and if the right questions are being asked. Whether authority will be exercised appropriately, and whether judgment will hold up under stress. That is leadership capability. And leadership capability has to be built. Now, this doesn't mean crisis plans are unimportant. They absolutely matter. In fact, strong crisis plans can do several valuable things. Those are reducing confusion, accelerate response, define roles, improve structure, support communications, and especially reduce wasted time in the early stages of an event. All of that matters. But what makes those plans useful is whether leaders are well prepared enough to use them. That is the difference. A strong plan in the hands of weak leadership can still produce confusion. And a decent plan in the hands of disciplined, aligned leadership will probably outperform expectations. That does not mean plans are secondary. It means plans and leadership are not interchangeable. Both matter, but they do different work. So what does real crisis leadership require beyond a plan? First, it requires clarity under pressure. A real crisis creates ambiguity. The facts may be incomplete. The situation may change quickly. People will be anxious, and information will often conflict. Leaders need the ability to cut through the noise and clarify what matters most. A document cannot do that by itself. Second, it requires decision-making discipline. Leaders often need to make consequential decisions before they have perfect information. And that requires judgment, it requires calm, and it requires the ability to weigh trade-offs quickly. It requires enough structure to act without becoming reckless. Again, a plan may support that, but it cannot create it. Third, it requires communication discipline. A crisis often becomes worse when communication becomes inconsistent, delayed, incomplete, or emotionally reactive. Leaders have to communicate in ways that reduces confusion, reinforces priorities, and helps the organization stay aligned. And that takes more than a communication appendix in a plan. Fourth, it requires role clarity in practice. What I mean by that is a plan may define roles on paper, but under pressure, the real question becomes, do people understand their roles well enough to act effectively? And do they trust the structure? Do they know who decides? And do they know when to escalate? Do they know when to lead and when to support? That only becomes real when leadership capability has been built and practiced. And fifth, a real crisis leadership requires composure with purpose. And I say with purpose because calm alone is not enough. A leader can sound calm and still be ineffective. Real composure is useful when it supports clearer thinking, better prioritization, and more disciplined action. That is what the business needs in a crisis. Now, I want to make an important point here. Crisis leadership is not just a trait. It is not just a personality, and it's not just whether someone is naturally confident or steady. It can be strengthened, and it can be developed through clarity of structure, defined roles, leadership discussions, scenario analysis, tabletop exercises, communications practice, and after-action learning. And then repeated exposure to disciplined preparedness thinking. That is important because it means organizations are not stuck with whatever leadership capability they happen to have today. You can build it, you can train, and you can practice around it. And that is exactly why this topic matters so much. Because too many organizations think they are improving crisis leadership when they are only improving crisis documentation. Documentation helps, but leadership capability has to be trained, challenged, and matured. This also connects closely to crisis exercises. Exercises do not just test the plan, they test the leaders using the plan. They reveal where decisions stall, where roles are unclear, where communications break, and where assumptions fail. They'll also expose where leadership alignment is weak and where the organization still depends too heavily on improvisation. That is why exercises are so valuable. They help convert crisis planning into crisis capability. And this connects directly to endurance. Because endurance in business is the ability to continue operating, make sound decisions, recover intelligently, and keep moving forward under pressure over time. Crisis leadership supports endurance because crises are moments where the organization's leadership quality becomes highly visible. If leaders stay clear, aligned, disciplined, and communicative, the business has a stronger chance of staying functional and forward moving. But if leadership weakens, delays, fragments, or confuses the organization, consequences often grow quickly. That is why leadership matters so much. And enduring business does not assume that a plan will do the leading for it. It prepares the leaders to use structure well, decide responsibly, and communicate clearly when pressure is highest. That is the difference. Now here's a practical question for you. If your organization faced a serious disruption today, would your crisis plan be supporting capable leadership or compensating for leadership capability that has not yet been built strongly enough? That's a powerful question. You could also ask questions such as, have our leaders practiced together under pressure? Do they know what good crisis leadership looks like here? Would they align quickly? Would communications hold up? And would key decisions happen with enough speed and clarity? Would the plan be usable, or would leadership still depend too heavily on improvisation? Those are great questions because they shift the focus from paperwork alone to actual leadership readiness. And that is where the real value is. So here's today's leadership takeaway. A crisis plan can provide structure, but it does not create crisis leadership. Leadership capability has to be built before the crisis if the plan is going to be truly useful when the pressure is real. That's the point. So here's today's question for you. Does your organization have a crisis plan, a crisis leadership capability, or both? That's an important distinction because when disruption hits, it is not the existence of the document alone that shapes the outcome. It is the quality of the leadership using it. And thank you for joining me today on the Morning Endurance Call. If this is the kind of thinking that is useful to you and your organization, join the free endurance community. That is where I'm sharing additional resources, tools, live streaming, live learning, and ongoing conversations for business owners, executives, and practitioners who want to build stronger businesses through preparedness, leadership, and endurance. The link will be in the description below. And tomorrow, we'll talk about why the first 30 minutes of a crisis matter most. Because what happens early often shapes everything that follows. Until then, think clearly, prepare deliberately, and lead with endurance. Thank you for joining. Bye now.